I'm Brandon Staglin, and this is One Mind, Brainwaves, where we talk with leaders for brain science and mental health who are making waves for better mental health. An estimated 8% of Americans, or about 24.4 million people, develop post-traumatic stress after traumatic events like a car accident, military combat, severe illness, or even abuse or neglect, or death of a loved one. Many things can cause post-traumatic stress. These conditions can impair daily functions and can even lead to long-term disability. In 2016, the National Institutes of Health launched the largest study ever of post-traumatic stress and what happens to the brain following trauma. It's called Aurora, and it aims to understand better how to make new treatments and new ways to diagnose post-traumatic stress before it even starts, so people can live their best and fullest lives following trauma. It's funded in part by One Mind. Later in the show, we'll be talking with one of the lead researchers on this study. But first, we'll talk with a primary caregiver for someone who lives with post-traumatic stress. Anne Atkinson's husband, Dave, is a post-9/11 combat veteran who returned from his tour of duty in Iraq with multiple injuries. And Anne is a 2020 fellow with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. She also is a member of the Brain Injury Alliance of Arizona. Anne, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us on Brainwaves today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Great to see you. So viewers, thank you for watching. Feel free to post comments or questions in the chat at any time. If you know of anyone who might benefit from the information we're providing in today's webcast, please share this with them as well. Thank you. So Anne, can you please tell us a little about your family's story and how you came to be your husband's primary caregiver following his service?
Absolutely. I met my husband after he was through with his service in the Marine Corps. And at the time, he was pretty healthy. We knew he had post-traumatic stress. So I educated myself on those things, but didn't really think that anything would be wrong. He was our primary breadwinner, all of those things. And over time, his symptoms started to come on, and his health began to deteriorate to a point that he could no longer work. So I had to take over as the primary breadwinner, and I actually worked nights as a bartender to provide for our family before his benefits came in, and that took about a year and a half. We had little kids at home, so I was mom during the day and bartender at night, caregiver during the day. I was very tired, so don't ask me questions about that time because I probably won't remember. It's all just a blur. But I didn't realize I was a caregiver for about 4 years. It took the VA caregiver support program basically shaking me, saying, "You're a caregiver." And I think it's because I'm a wife, I'm a mom. Of course, I love my husband. I want to take care of him. So I didn't put two and two together. But as soon as I really accepted that that was what I was doing, everything changed and it got a lot better.
Wow, that resonates with me too. I mean, coming to a point in your mind where you can accept the role that is important for you to engage in can really help liberate. I've experienced this too, liberate people from like the preconceptions they had about who they used to be or what their responsibilities used to be, and just focus on what really matters now. So your story, thank you for sharing your story so far, and the care that you've given your family. That's tremendous. I really admire that. You say that Dave had classic symptoms of PTS. What exactly did you observe in Dave, in his case?
So with Dave, he has the nightmares and the flashbacks, and he hates crowds, loud noises. We laugh at things because it's laugh or cry, but he has this huge startle response. So we had to do this whole intervention with our kids to stop scaring dad. It's kind of funny, but it's not funny. Stop doing that. And I mean, it's all those classic relationships became hard for him because people don't really understand the nuances of post-traumatic stress, and he seems fine one day and he's not fine the other. So all of those things. And then the interesting thing with post-traumatic stress and with a lot of mental health issues is they feed off of each other. So he started to have these other symptoms. I mean, you have depression, he had traumatic brain injury, he has neurological issues, and the PTS is just that undercurrent that's kind of just bugging everything, kind of in an interesting and weird way. But he has all of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and his is severe.
Gosh, I'm sorry to hear he's been through a rough time with that. Um, and it's interesting how there's so much overlap and like feeding off like a kind of a vicious cycle of developing one condition to develop other conditions. But it's great that it sounds like you've helped him have some insight into his condition, or has he developed that on his own, just recognizing that he does have, for example, you mentioned the startle response. That's something that you talk about openly together, and he recognizes what those are, and maybe that helps him manage it better.
Yes, there's the obvious triggers. Triggers are things with people who have post-traumatic stress. It can be a smell, it can be a song, it can be temperature, and it's unintentional, and it just switches over to that part of their brain that wants to fight, flight, or freeze, and they can't help it. And so we've learned what most of the triggers are through trial and error. So once things calm down, we'll have a talk about it. He's done a lot of therapy. I went to therapy with him. I spent so much time. I read everything I could. I'm lucky my dad's a therapist. I picked his brain all the time. I talked to doctors and really took a lot of time because I wanted to understand what was happening, because when we don't understand things, it feels scary. And now when he's triggered, I know exactly what's happening. He knows exactly what's happening, and that's empowering for both of us and for our kids because they understand too.
Oh, it sounds like you're in a better situation than you certainly would have been if you hadn't had that education and taken the initiative to do that. Fantastic. We know that caring with somebody with brain health challenges can be isolating at times, and you did mention how you were tired in those initial years. Thankfully, one of your close family members, you just mentioned your father is a therapist, and you said he was able to provide some much needed guidance for you. Where else did you turn for learning about post-traumatic stress and connection?
So the first, I think I said 4 years, I didn't know anybody in our situation. And I think that is one of the biggest problems for caregivers and people with any kind of mental health issue. And we tend to do that as humans. Oh, I'm the only one. I'm so weird. This is something. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want people to judge me. So I and we weren't doing as well then, obviously, as we are now, because things have changed, and we can go into that. But my dad helped me. The caregiver support program at the VA in Portland is stellar. They have amazing staff. They literally took me by the hand and taught me how to be a good caregiver. And another thing with being a caregiver is we lose the sense of who we are, and we forget all about what makes me happy, what's my purpose in life, all of those things. And they have an amazing program called Whole Health that teaches veterans, caregivers, anyone, honestly, anyone would benefit from it, how to take back control of our lives, the things that we can control, and find ourselves again. So those have been my amazing resources that have helped basically make our family function and be happy again.
What a great program, the Whole Health. It sounds like you've learned some great ways to approach life from that. I wish I could see it, what that's like. Maybe there are resources that others can access as well, similar to that. But glad you found that. How hard was it for Dave to get an official diagnosis for his condition? And to what extent did that help with him getting treatment for his PTS?
So we're still on that journey. He is diagnosed with a post-traumatic stress. That was his first diagnosis, but then as other symptoms came trickling in, you have therapists and all these people saying, well, that's not PTS, that must be something else. So we're still in pursuit of some diagnoses, mostly from toxic exposure issues. But again, the PTS is the undercurrent that just likes to keep everything irritated. So after he has had great care and great therapists, great doctors on the mental health side at the VA. And I mean, his case is interesting. And so you can tell that they're really trying to figure it out and help him. And some therapies haven't worked. He tried prolonged exposure. That didn't work. He tried talk therapy. It's not his favorite. Doesn't really, it's nice to be able to process things, but it hasn't mitigated any of the symptoms. One of his favorites that he's doing right now is internal family systems, which is amazing. He loves it, and he's getting a lot of insight with that. And then also somatic exposure.
It's great. He's had access to so many therapies like that, and some are starting to help. Let's learn more about some of these. Maybe are there any resources you can recommend, like websites to people could visit to learn more about these things? Do you know, like offhand, where to go for those? You could mention that.
Sure. Internal family systems, you can even just Google that. There's therapists who help you with it. There's books. I can't think of the name of the book right now, but you can even do it for yourself with guided through the book activities. Whole Health, you can Google that. There's the Whole Health Institute. If you are a military or veteran, you can go through the American Red Cross or the VA. Also here in Arizona, we offer it at the Brain Injury Alliance of Arizona to anyone, even if you're not associated with the military at all. And then somatic exposure, I would say the same thing, Google it. And if you have a therapist or a doctor, ask them, because not all treatments are going to be great for everyone. Trust your provider. If you don't have a provider that you trust, get a different one. It's okay. And ask those questions, advocate for yourself. And if they think it might be a good fit, try it. And if it works, awesome. If it doesn't, try something else.
Fantastic. Also, thanks for recommending those. Would the Elizabeth Dole Foundation be another resource to check out as well?
Oh, absolutely. The Elizabeth Dole Foundation has so many programs for caregivers, military and veteran caregivers. There's the Hidden Heroes Caregiver Community. That's on Facebook. And this is one of the biggest ones because that isolation piece is so huge. I thought I was alone. It's interesting. Everyone thinks they're alone in this. There's 5.5 million military and veteran caregivers serving in our country right now. And they provide $14 billion a year in unpaid care. And they think they're the only one. They're not. There's so many of us. So we get to connect on the Hidden Heroes Caregiver Community. It's vetted. They make sure everyone's legit. There's monitors. So if something kind of goes awry, they get it back in check. The Elizabeth Dole Foundation offers free respite, no questions asked, besides, let's make sure you're a veteran. A lot of people have used it for meal prep or house cleaning or just being able to take a break. There's emergency financial assistance. They have a program that they partnered with the VA called Campaign for Inclusive Care, and that teaches providers and caregivers how to include the caregiver on the care team, because studies have shown a well-supported caregiver is the best way to support a veteran, and they actually end up having better health outcomes when that caregiver is included on the care team.
Wow, what great insights. What a great model that that foundation uses, Elizabeth Dole Foundation. Thanks for explaining about that. So how does Dave's post-traumatic stress impact his and your day-to-day life now?
It does affect us every day. Even this morning, he had an appointment, and he doesn't like to know about them because he sits and worries, and it turns into this thing. So he asked me not to tell him until right before appointments. So I'm getting ready for the day, and he asked what I'm doing. Nothing. I'm just getting ready for the day, and then kind of spring on him. But again, it's out of respect, and it's what he asked for. I had another caregiver explain it, that she goes ahead of her veteran and finds all the bombs and detonates them before he can get to them. And I definitely relate to that, trying to mitigate triggers, but also pushing him a little bit. He's a grown man. He can make his own decisions. He does not like to be babied. He's a Marine, obviously. But there's certain things, like, let's not scare dad. Let's not go to a super crowded place, things like that. And then when he is triggered, we have our ways of helping him work through that. And we end up having, more good days than bad days, but it is definitely a part of our life on a daily basis.
Wow. It sounds like the love of your family makes a lot of difference for Dave and holds you together in a very beautiful way. What does self-care look like for you? And what do you do to take care of your own mental and emotional health? Perhaps things you've learned from the whole health program or other things.
Yes, self-care is such a buzzword right now, but I'm glad that it is. It's it's so important for everybody, caregivers especially, because we again lose ourselves. We don't have time. We picture like going to the spa or taking this bubble bath or going on vacation. That's not an option for a lot of us. So drinking my coffee outside in the backyard in the morning for 15 minutes, that's me time. I need that. Drinking more water, going to bed on time, these tiny little things. And you touched on it, the whole health taught me to look at every aspect of my life, including things that you don't think about that contribute to your health, like surroundings or relationships. And you break down those areas, see what's working, give yourself a nice pat on the back, see what's not working, and then you break it down more and look at why. And then you make these tiny little baby goals that you can work on every day, nothing huge. And over time, it snowballs into these huge, amazing life changes. So that's how I practice my self-care. I've been doing whole health since 2016. My whole family does it. That's the way we call it living. That's the way we live, is through those principles.
It's wonderful. Great. You have such a good approach. And you say that people with PTS are not scary, they are scared. What else has caring for Dave and your own advocacy taught you?
I am resilient. I think that I wasn't as patient as I am now. And so I've learned a lot of patience. I've learned being an advocate, our voices matter. Advocacy works. I used to not share my story. I used to not really tell friends what was going on, those kinds of things. And obviously, that's going to contribute to my isolation and feeling all of the feelings that come along with that. I think that I've learned to meet people where they're at. We can't expect someone to be somewhere they're not. And if someone's going through something hard, it doesn't matter what that looks like. If it's a mental health issue or, a loss or grieving, we go through a grieving process when we are diagnosed with things or when our health declines. Accepting that and meeting each other where we're at and just giving each other that support and love without judgment is what I've learned from Dave. I've also learned to laugh at everything. He laughs at everything. And it makes things a lot easier because, again, we went through that grief process. Absolutely. Both of us did as his health declined. And then just one day he said, I'm sick of being sad about this. Let's just laugh at it. So we kind of laugh at the little funny things, but laughter and love, support, meeting each other where we're at. That's what I've learned from
I
my
love,
journey.
thank you for sharing that. That's so beautiful. I think acceptance and laughter come hand in hand. I think that, once you accept that, well, this is going to be it, well, might as well, laugh at it and make the best out of it. Thank you for sharing. And finally, what words of hope or advice do you have for others who might be struggling with PTS or caring for somebody with a condition? And yeah, what do you have to share?
My advice would be, I say it all the time, and I've already said it, you're not the only one. It's okay to find safe, the keyword is safe, people to be vulnerable with. There's a tribe out there for you. Keep looking till you find it. Try an art class, try a group. If you don't like it, try something else. You'll find other people who are on similar journeys, and I can't emphasize enough how healing that is to sit with someone. It doesn't even have to be the exact same thing, but someone who kind of understands, and laughing about it or crying about it or venting about it, it's total game changer. So trying to pull yourself out of that self-isolation would be my number one advice. And words of hope. Words of hope. There's so many. I think it's a barrier. It's a hurdle to have post-traumatic stress or any mental health illness, but it's not a stop sign. It's like a yield sign. Let's figure out how to get through this. Let's figure out how to control what we can. Let's figure out how to find the right treatments. And I would say figure out how to be happy again, even with all of the things that are added to our plates.
Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful advice and gives me hope as well. A lot of it resonates. Thank you. So Anne, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being on Brainwaves, and thanks for the great advocacy you do to help people who live with post-traumatic stress. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and wish you and your family all the best.
Thank you. You too.
Our next guest is someone who's on the forefront of groundbreaking research in memory, trauma, and post-traumatic stress. Dr. Vishnu Murty is an assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience at Temple University. He's also the principal investigator in the Adaptive Memory Lab. Deepu, thanks so much for being with us on Brainwaves today.
I'm so glad to be here, Brandon.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Great to meet you, and looking forward to hearing more about your research. So let's get started. So first off, let me say to the audience first, actually, thank you for watching Brainwaves today. And if you have any questions or comments you'd like to post in the chat, please go ahead and do that. Also, if you have anyone you know who might benefit from the information we're sharing in today's webcast, please send this video to them. Thanks. Okay, Vishnu, back to you. Shall I call you Deepu or Vishnu?
Deepu would be great. Yeah.
Okay, Deepu it is. I love it. Thank you. So Deepu, first off, what got you interested in neuroscience as a career and the study of memory in particular? Why did you choose this over some other branch of science or other career path?
It was a pretty long and winding road, accelerated through undergraduate. Sort of bouncing all over the place. So I came into undergrad really thinking I wanted to be a doctor. Both of my parents were doctors, so I was like, this is what you do when you like science. You become a doctor. And sort of quickly weaving in and out of a lot of classes, I realized I was drawn very much to sort of basic science research. Then I sort of shot a little bit too low and was exploring things in like chemistry and cellular and molecular bio. But the more you learn about the brain, the more you just want to sort of get back to behavior, right? It's one thing that's like, see how cool it is that all these things in the brain are happening, but the final output, the thing that you have a sense of intuition about in the world, is sitting somewhere between that biology and then like actual expressed human behavior. So over the course of sort of 4 years in undergrad and then doing some research afterwards, I sort of landed in the spot that I was really interested in sort of brain mechanisms of human behavior. And then I was drawn to memory specifically because, I wish I had a more nuanced way to saying this, but it's awesome, right? Like, it's this like really wild, wonderful thing that we experience every day. And then you can also study that in a cell or in a rat or in a monkey or in a human, in a kid, right? It just has so many ways to take different angles of it to really narrow in on the mechanisms that are happening.
Wow, it is fascinating. Memory is kind of a tricky thing. Like sometimes we remember things, sometimes we don't. And there's this kind of seems to be a tendency to remember certain things over others. Like, let's talk about that. So what's the most important thing you've learned about memory, and why do we sometimes tend to remember like more stressful or even traumatic events more easily or more readily than we remember like more mundane events? Is there like a scientific explanation for this?
Yes, this could be a 7-hour podcast, but I won't do that. I'll try to trim it a little bit. So this is exactly what my lab is interested in, is sort of where does the selectivity of memory emerge from? And I would say the most important thing we've learned, and it sort of gets at that selectivity, is that we have a pretty spotty, inaccurate representation of our past. It can feel like we're really recording everything. But as you said it, we do separate the things that we deem important versus mundane. And the way our lab is looking at this, heavily based off of sort of animal models of learning and memory, is that when we have important events happen, whether it's something threatening like running into a snake on a hike or something beautiful like seeing that gorgeous sunset on a hike, different brain chemical systems are engaged in those moments. And throughout evolution, these same systems that sort of, help us embody the behaviors we need in that moment, that escape behavior or the savoring of a sunset behavior, right? Those are connected with our systems that determine our long-term memories, right? So in the moment, we're doing all the experiential things to respond to either a threat or reward in our environment, but then our brain has adapted these systems to transform that into a memory. But what's, I think, particularly important, particularly neat, is that it's not just, is it forgotten or is it remembered? But we really need to start thinking, how was it transformed? Is it distorted? Are some things selected over other things, right? So you can go back to that example of seeing the snake in the woods, right? And you might reflect on that memory later. Good luck remembering what joke your friend told you right before you saw that snake, right? Like you might not have memory for that, but you will probably remember the thing that you hid behind or, the stripes that were around the back of the snake. So if anything, I would say like, let me reframe your question, Brandon, and not say, why do we remember some things better than others, but how do we remember important things differently than we remember more boring things?
Interesting. So yeah, like the process behind that, the scientific basis for that, and like how that turns out in our future behavior. Pretty
right.
much.
Yeah. Because the way we shape it, in some ways, our memories are sort of the goggles we wear to explore the world, right? So depending on what we capture from a given moment, we're going to have a very different way of how we move through the world.
Okay. Yeah, that does make sense. That totally makes sense. So that brings us to our next question. We do remember things that you're saying that are stressful or traumatic more than mundane events. And with the rising tide of stress and inequity in today's world, traumatic events are becoming more common.
Yes.
And I'm curious, how powerful a role can trauma play in one's future mental health? And what role do memory and its underlying brain mechanisms play in that process?
Yeah, this is the question for somebody who studies emotional memory. I think we know hands down it is enormous, right? We know the effects of trauma. For a while, people were really focusing on, motor vehicle collisions or when we send people off to war and sort of these really, precise traumatic events that exist. But I think over the past, 5 to 10 years, we're also thinking about systemic trauma and racial trauma and trauma due to poverty and complex trauma from poor parenting skills, right? All these things combined. And again, I think like shape just again, the way we walk through the world. In some ways, the only existence of the past is through our memories, and the past is the only thing we have to guide us in the moment. So it's hugely important. And it's funny, you can get a room of like 15 trauma researchers together and everybody's going to have their, the linchpin of what they think is doing it, right? Like, here's the thing that really matters when you study trauma. I'm obviously biased because I'm a memory researcher, but I do think memories are particularly important when we think about this because if you just go down to symptoms of trauma, right? Some of the major symptoms of trauma are experiences of reliving or flashbacks, which we know are grounded in memory in some way. But then you can also think of what is your therapist trying to help you work through when you sit down to get psychotherapy for trauma, right? And when you look at that, a lot of it is sort of reconstructing the narrative around your memory, processing the memory, reinterpreting the memory, reevaluating the memory, sort of giving you just sort of like, an adaptive tool to work on trauma. The adaptive tool that therapists have landed on to work on trauma is shaping memory. And then we can jump all the way to the other side, right? And think about all these animal models we have of trauma. So, putting rats in a cage and shocking them, right? And then seeing how they sort of cope with being in another cage or a similar cage. all of those studies at the same time have found this key critical role for the hippocampus in guiding what we think is safe, what we think is dangerous. Are we going to generalize our fear to everything, or are we going to keep it really specific to a narrow thing? And what you get that is the hippocampus, the same region that's guiding whether animals think an environment is safe or dangerous, is also the same region that we know in humans constructs our memories and our narratives of our life, right? So you put these two things together, and it just seems like it has to be one of the major linchpins of trying to understand trauma, because it's showing up across the sort of wide array of how you can conceptualize trauma.
That's amazing. So putting these puzzle pieces together, you're developing an understanding of how trauma, it leads to future post-traumatic stress and other mental health challenges based on trauma. Wow, this is fascinating. And getting to the kind of the meat of it, in 2016, the National Institutes of Health launched the Aurora Study, which is the largest study of its kind on trauma and post-traumatic stress. One Mind has provided important funding for this study. We're very proud of this. And you're one of the lead researchers in the study. What are some of the results coming out of the Aurora Study, and how can these discoveries start to help veterans and also civilian trauma survivors manage post-traumatic stress better?
Yeah, so it is a really impressive data set. So hashtag thank you One Mind, because this is really an unprecedented data set. And we're working our way through it with so many different teams focused on sort of different spaces of it. But one of the amazing things about the Aurora study, and this was actually, I'm not a clinician in my trade. I'm a basic scientist, but I learned this as being part of the Aurora study. If you take somebody after they're experiencing a traumatic event, sort of 2 weeks out, right? Up to 70% of people will show symptoms that look like PTSD or symptoms associated with PTSD. Jump out then 3 more months later, and that number reduces down to under 20%, right? So there is something that the brain is doing that's adaptive early, right? But then you have to think about the sequelae of events that come afterwards that are going to dictate, which path are you on, right? If we're all more or less looking the same after a traumatic event, and then the paths start to deviate over time, those are sort of the things we need to capture. And the way Aurora was set up is that they are continuously collecting data throughout the sequelae of the trauma, meaning you're in the emergency room, you get your first data point, but then they're collecting data on watches every day and flash surveys, and then coming into the lab to do blood tests and brain tests and pain tests, right? So we're able to start to capture how these things are extending over time. I would say, from a science resource pot, it's enormous, right? We have so much there to find out. I think we're about a couple steps away from figuring out how these basic science things we're looking at are gonna convey into something that can really, be tangible in the hands of somebody who's suffering PTSD symptoms. But I don't think we're that far away. So just to narrow it in a little bit, I've been mainly focused on the neuroimaging results of this study. And we are getting findings that are sort of surprising or unexpected, or not the same brain regions that people were thinking about when you're doing individual slices of time in a given moment, right? So you can imagine it's a discovery toolbox, right? We might not have been thinking about circuit A or circuit B when we are exploring, where should we be targeting? What type of processes do we need to sort of alter to get people on a trajectory that's closer to being less distressing to more distressing? And I think that's what Aurora is really giving us, is the big picture view. And then you can take that big picture and really narrow in on one part of it and start to dissect in that space.
Oh, what an amazing resource. And it's great to see some of the papers that have come out already, and the discoveries that have come out around how to predict whether somebody might be on that path of retaining the post-traumatic stress symptoms or having them get worse versus having them get better.
Right.
And I encourage viewers to check out some of those papers later on. I'm very curious also, is there a way that we can immunize ourselves or build resilience against traumatic events based on what you've learned in your research, that can help people who experience trauma to continue to live fulfilling and constructive lives and avoid the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes. Okay. So my fair warnings beforehand. I am not a clinician, right? So we're going into high speculation mode when you're talking to a basic scientist. But I can tell you, at least in the space that I've been looking at, which is really how these memory systems interact with other systems like stress systems and arousal systems, and how those predict symptomology moving forward. For me, I think there's ways to foster resilience. And of course, I've admitted this before, I'm like a memory freak, right? So I'm going to put things through that lens. But what we found in one of our studies, right, was this region, the hippocampus, that stores memory. It stores these really flexible memories of the world, right? These are the memories that you can sort of relive in your head and walk through and sort of rotate and orient around a lot. And what we found is that this key region for serving those memory processes, for individuals that show very high defensive responses, they're less likely to use the hippocampus to store their memories. And rather, it seems like they're using other systems that have more rigid forms of memory, sort of types of memories that we don't have a lot of control over, right? And sort of using that as a key insight, that this ability to form flexible memories is really important. There are sort of a host of therapeutic techniques, even if we're just thinking about different forms of psychotherapy that work on trauma as narrative, right? So working with sort of playing with that memory, and even if you don't have that narrative there to begin with, how do you take this traumatic event and build it into your own life narrative? In other words, can we get the hippocampus on board afterwards? Even if it wasn't there for the trauma, can we start to say, like, okay, we know that if you don't engage this region, you're going to have symptoms of trauma. Is there a way post hoc that we can sort of bring it back into the network so that we can both sort of, it's hard because I don't want to be dualist that say like, oh, the brain's doing one thing and your mind's doing another thing, but sort of re-engaging the hippocampus might be a way to sort of get that circuit embodied more by sort of bringing our mind back into the interface. And there's all this stuff coming out, and we're sort of right on the cusp of it, of how do we make narratives out of something that we find traumatic. And I think utilizing our knowledge of what the hippocampus likes, what it responds to, we can start to think about things like tailoring therapy in a way to really, really engage it, right? And I think these are the types of discoveries I'm most excited about, is can we take these models of the brain and then actually try to move it into something, tangible that you can work on a day-to-day life basis.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like, you use your word, memory is awesome, and what you can do with it is awesome.
Thank you. I convinced somebody.
Yeah, and it fits with some of my own experiences about traumatic experiences in my past life, and then I've been able to reinterpret them, talking with friends about them, and just kind of get a new perspective that really gives me a lot more confidence in how I can ascribe meaning to those events. So,
right.
That's really cool. Well, that's fantastic. So looking ahead to the future, can you paint a picture for us of where your research is going, and what words of hope can you offer to individuals who are experiencing post-traumatic stress and to their families?
Yeah, so I think the research that we're really targeting right now, sort of a follow-up, really very much inspired by Aurora, right, is that we know there's these regions like the hippocampus, right, that are showing a default. And we know a lot about the experiential feeling of a traumatic memory, right? But we're sort of missing the bridge between those two things. Like, how do we map on this experience of yourself in the memory with the brain states that sort of drive them there? So right now, our lab is really working on trying to understand, in the context of threat and fear, how do these different brain circuitries help us construct narratives? Are the narratives fragmented? Are the narratives continuous, right? And again, in a sense of hope, or sort of speaking to individuals that are suffering from trauma, we know the starting point right now. I think we're getting pretty good at knowing the starting point of where trauma symptoms emerge. We know the end point. I mean, survivors of trauma know the endpoint much stronger than I do, right? But we know the endpoint of where there is. And I am really seeing massive headwork happening of combining these two things. And I think, I'm inspired by where this is going for a couple reasons. One, I think it's a lot of opportunities for treatment, right? I think we're focusing on finding new versions of treatment. But the other thing, and again, this is almost excluding the world of trauma that's sort of, centered around car collisions or abuse that's very prominent, or things like being in combat. But there's these other forms of trauma that, societally are evoking a sense of gaslighting or people not taking them seriously. You think of things like racism-induced trauma, right? Or structural inequality-based trauma. And there's almost a societal impact that's questioning the belief of the impact of some of these different traumatic states, which I personally, not to get politicized, think that's horrible, right? But I think what we're leveraging with studies like Aurora, with the studies we're doing in our laboratory, is to start to understand some of the brain mechanisms that are underlying these other forms of trauma, not the ones that we were talking about the 70s, the ones that we're talking about today in the 2020s. And while we're working on treatment, I'm also hoping this gives us a sense of a place to sort of bring advocacy to get more recognition and sort of, more justice, right, in the space. And, it should be enough that people's voices is enough to subserve that justice, but we're hoping, if they're not always being heard, maybe we can bring some neuroscience in to help shift some minds.
Yeah, thank you. Neuroscience is such a powerful tool to understand the brain, to explain our experiences. Yeah. And so people can really grasp, if they don't grasp it from the face value of what people are saying, the underlying things that are happening inside the body. I mean, that's something tangible that you can point to on a scan or whatever, to as additional evidence for the validity of people's experiences. Well, thank you for doing that. A very important work, Deepu. Thank you so much for spending time with us on Brainwaves today. It's been a treat to talk to you and learn from you. Viewers, thank you as well. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to post them now. Also, if you have any interest in learning more about the Aurora study, please visit onemind.org/Aurora. If you'd like to learn more about past Brainwaves episodes, please visit onemind.org/Brainwaves, where you can find them all there, as well as sign up for our e-newsletter, where you can learn about future webcast episodes. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Remember, what is your brain good for? Making waves, of course. Thanks for watching. Bye, everyone. Have a great day and see you next time on Brainwaves.
I'm living my best life.